Spectrovision Radio.
It all started when the bartender put another drink in front of me and told me it was on the guy at the other end of the bar. I lifted my head, which had already been drooping with the predictable heaviness of inebriation, and saw a man staring back at me. He looked out of place, his outfit too precise, his hair and beard too well groomed and smile too pleasant to fit in amongst the patrons of the dive bar I'd had my ass parked in for a couple of hazy hours. His generosity was odd, sure, but my mission was to get drunk, and I wasn't about to get picky when it came to accepting more booze from total strangers. I lifted the drink in a silent toast and nodded at him as a silent thank you, but he took that as an invitation to come over. As he neared, I got a whiff of his cologne, strong but pleasant. I added smells too good to the list of things that made him not fit in with the surroundings. He introduced himself as Jeffrey, and once he'd opened his mouth, he seemed totally harmless, mild-mannered and well-spoken, with the faintest hint of a foreign accent I couldn't quite place. We started off with some idle chit-chat, and that was okay. But I was already drunk and steadily losing my filter. I soon found myself divulging more than I should, and promptly began using him as a sounding board for all my problems, the fact that I was totally broke being top of the tree. He listened with a sympathetic look in his eyes, nodding along as I mapped out how I'd ended up this way, until I paused and took him in again. "I have to ask," I said, inhibitions fading with each sip. "What's someone like you doing in a place like this?" Jeffrey set his drink down on the bar, but he didn't appear to be offended. More like he was mulling over what I'd asked, considering it carefully. "Everyone has something they want to escape," he replied. I didn't have long to consider what it was that he might have to run from, because he snapped his fingers like he just had a eureka moment. "You could house sit for me," he said, enthusiastically. "You said you needed money? Well, just so happens I'm looking for someone to take care of my place while I'm away, and I haven't got anyone for the job yet." I'm not sure why, but I hesitated. He must have noticed, because the next thing he did was tell me how much he was willing to pay, and it wasn't an amount I felt comfortable saying no to. "The animals will need feeding," he added, "but that really is the only thing you'd have to do." I looked up at him again. It seemed to be a genuine offer. I kicked myself for hesitating, for even giving him an opportunity to back out, and agreed. Jeffrey then told me he had to get going, gave me his number and the dates he needed me to house sit for him, and told me to call him closer to the time for the details. I called Jeffrey a few days before I was meant to be heading up there, just as he'd asked. As the phone rang and rang, I started to feel like a fool, like maybe he'd been toying with me for some kind of sick fun, kicking a man when he was down. Maybe that was how he got his rocks off, hopping from one bar to another, torturing down and outs like me with the promise of cash, a promise he'd never intended to make good on. But Jeffrey did eventually answer, still wanted me to feed the animals, and was still saying he'd pay me what he'd offered. He gave me the address and told me where he'd hide the keys so I could let myself in. He also told me I was welcome to help myself to any food and drink in the house, whatever I wanted for the duration of my stay. "And all the instructions about feeding the animals will be there for you," he added. I looked up the address as soon as I got off the phone. The house was in a small town, really close by, a short drive inland from the coast. From what I could see online, it seemed affluent but quiet, the kind of place people with money went if they desired bigger property and peace and quiet, but wanted to maintain access to the city. A few days later, I drove up there. The house was big, not a mansion per se, and absolutely beautiful. It was hardly my forte, but it looked to me like a modern rendition of something from the Victorian era. Grandiose and asymmetrical, flanked by immaculate greenery and boasting views all the way down to the coast. I let myself in and decided to start by giving myself a little tour of the place. Like Jeffrey, the interior was old-fashioned, despite the fact that it had all the modern trimmings like an enormous flat-screen TV and space-age-looking kitchen appliances. I made my way through, marveling at how a single person could have so much room to themselves, taking it all in with a mixture of admiration and jealousy. It was all mine for a few days, but there was one locked door on the second floor, which I assumed was Jeffrey's bedroom, considering I hadn't found anything else that gave the impression of being the place he slept. The other bedrooms I'd found clearly meant for guests. Though I was curious, I got it. Personal space, I thought. Fair enough. As I descended the staircase, deciding I'd better find the instructions on feeding the animals he'd left for me, I took note of the framed pictures that lined the wall to my left. One stood out in particular. Black and white. Old. I could tell by the background, an ancient town square flanked by squat buildings with ornate balconies, that it had been taken somewhere in Europe. I'd only met Jeffrey once and hadn't been that sober at the time, but the image of him in my mind told me the man in the picture was related to him. Probably a great-grandfather or something. I looked closer and noticed there was something written in the bottom right-hand corner of the frame. Praha, 1901. I was fairly certain Praha was Prague, and a quick search using my phone told me I was correct. I looked at the next picture. It depicted the same man, this time in front of what looked like the entrance to some kind of coal mine. He had a pickaxe slung over his shoulder and was standing proudly next to something I couldn't quite decipher. It looked like a large rock whose precise contours suggested human intervention, with some kind of writing or symbols carved into it. An archaeological find, maybe? I wasn't sure, so I kept making my way down the stairs, peering at each subsequent photograph, realizing they showcased a family tree of what was clearly Jeffrey's lineage. I made my way into the kitchen, looked around, and stopped. I'd given myself a tour of the entire house, and I hadn't seen any instructions about feeding. I hadn't even seen any animals, or heard any for that matter, or been given any indication that any lived there. No dog bowls, no leads, no aquariums or cages. I grabbed my cell phone and called Jeffrey, thinking he'd probably forgotten to leave the instructions and that as soon as he filled me in it'd all be perfectly obvious. But the call wouldn't connect, and I realized he was probably on a flight to wherever it was he was going. I also realized in that moment that I didn't know if his destination was close by or long haul, domestic or international. So where the fuck were the animals? Maybe they're outdoor pets, I thought to myself. I ventured out the back of the house, into the pristine gardens. I did my best to search for any signs of life, but aside from a quick glimpse of a wild lizard and a few hovering bees, there were none. By nightfall, I'd managed to push my confusion aside. I'd achieved this by helping myself to the ostentatious stockpile of alcohol and frying up an expensive-looking steak I'd found in the bountifully stocked refrigerator. I'd installed myself on the couch in front of the enormous TV, binge-watching shows I hadn't caught up with since I'd had to cancel all my own subscriptions when money got tight, and the thought of the missing animals barely entered my consciousness. That was, until I heard something. I picked up the remote and paused the TV. Staying as still as possible, I tried to concentrate, to see if I could hear it again. There it was. Was it scratching? The closest thing I could think of was that it sounded like a dog or a cat, pawing at a door when they want to be let in, or let out. Had Jeffrey's pets returned from wherever the fuck they'd been? The sound continued, but where was it coming from? I got up off the couch and tried to pinpoint the source, but for some reason I kept getting turned around. 1 second I thought it was coming from one direction, somewhere else the next. After a couple of minutes of fruitless search, it stopped completely. I waited for it to return, but when it didn't, I went back to my booze and raided the freezer for ice cream. Rats, I thought. Maybe a squirrel or something. Not enough to put me off the night in I'd been so enjoying. The next day I called my friend Holly and suggested that she come hang out at Jeffrey's place. Telling her there was more booze and food than you could ever want sealed the deal. But before we got off the phone, I found myself telling her about the missing animals, about the strange noise I'd heard the night before. "Probably your mind playing tricks on you," she said. "Drunk and alone in a new place. It's not that weird." She made some sense, I had to admit. But what about the pets that were nowhere to be seen? "They weren't there when you got there?" she asked. I told her they weren't. "Well, then technically it's not your problem," she said. I mumbled a reply, still a little concerned I might get it in the neck from Jeffrey. "I know," Holly said. "I'll bring Hendrix with me. If there's an animal hiding somewhere, he'll find it." Hendrix was Holly's Jack Russell, a scrappy little thing that I, like many others, had a real soft spot for, and Hendrix had a habit of chasing anything that moved. I agreed that it seemed like a decent idea, and Holly said she'd come over that evening after work. I went out to meet Holly when I heard her car climbing up the driveway. She parked next to where I'd left my car, and she and Hendrix hopped out and started walking towards me as I stood in the frame of the open front doorway. When they were about 20 feet away, Hendrix froze. He sat back on his hind legs, and his whole body went rigid. Holly tried to drag him forward, but Hendrix flat out refused to come an inch closer to the house. The harder she pulled, the more he howled and moaned. We tried to coax him in with food, water. He simply would not budge, would not take a single step closer to the house. Holly settled on fastening his lead to her car door, and I gave him a bowl of water and a quick tummy rub before she and I ventured inside. We fixed lunch and hung out for a while, but each time I looked out the window and saw Hendrix outside, rooted to the spot and staring unwaveringly up at the house, well, it didn't exactly make for the most relaxing time. Once we finished eating, we tried to get Hendrix to come inside again, but it was no use. Not knowing what else to do, Holly said she'd better take him home. And once again, I was left alone. It was around 10 p.m. when it happened. I'd been watching TV again, but had ventured into the kitchen to fix myself a drink and throw together some snacks from the cabinets. I walked back into the living room, set down my drink, and when I turned to face the fireplace, I stopped dead. In the dim, constantly shifting glow of the TV, it looked as if there were fingers curling out from inside the chimney, as if someone was trying to climb down it. Despite every fiber of my being telling me otherwise, I inched closer. As my feet scuffed against the floor, the fingers moved, just as the TV flashed to a brighter scene, and my perception of what I was looking at shifted. They couldn't be fingers. They were too spindly. They looked more like the legs of some kind of insect. Somewhat less unnerved, I took another step closer, but whatever it was scuttled up the chimney and out of sight. Some kind of infestation, I thought. That's what's making the noises. Those things are probably everywhere. I sat back down on the couch and grabbed my drink. To me, booze seemed to be the best way to forget that I might be surrounded by a mass of crawling things. I woke up on the couch in the middle of the night. The scratching sounds were there again. Like the first time, I couldn't tell where they were coming from. And now drunkenness was giving way to hangover. The thought that the walls and floorboards might be infested with bugs started to make me feel insane. I picked something at random on the TV and turned up the volume, trying to drown it out. But then, I heard a different sound. I paused the TV and froze. It was the sound of another human voice. It was like someone moaning in pain. The closest thing I'd ever heard to it was when my grandfather was near to the end, and his body had been ravaged by debilitating arthritis. The way he'd cry out when he tried to move. and it sounded like it was somewhere inside the house. I downed the drink I discarded on the coffee table, needing some liquid courage, and forced myself to march through the place, top to bottom. But I found nothing. I even made myself head up the stairs to the locked door, to the room I suspected was Jeffrey's bedroom. Yet by the time I was standing outside it, the noise had stopped. But when I pressed my ear to it, I thought I could hear something. The moaning, but only very faintly. Maybe? Was I really hearing that? Or was it in my head? Fuck it, I said, and kicked the door open. At first, I was frustrated. It appeared to simply be a bedroom. That frustration quickly gave way to concern when I realized I'd have to explain to Jeffrey why I'd damaged his property. No use backing out now, though, I thought. I snooped around. It all seemed fairly ordinary, just predictably old-fashioned. But digging through the contents of an antique-looking chest, I found a leather-bound book. The writing within was so ornate it was difficult to decipher, and it looked like it was in several different languages I couldn't speak anyway. But there was something I could read. On the last page, in the very center of the yellowed paper, were the following words written in English. You offer up that which it needs, and it gives you that which you want. The chest also contained a photo album. I pored through it. It was like what I'd seen on the staircase. Pictures of Jeffrey's relatives dating far back through the ages. But now I could look closer, really study them. I was convinced that these men weren't Jeffrey's family at all. Jeffrey was the man in all the pictures. Different eras, different countries, different wives, different children. The one constant was that face. Jeffrey's face. Looking just the way it had when I'd met him at the bar. Never younger. Never older. My head was spinning. What the fuck was I looking at? I didn't have time to try to make sense of it, because then I heard the terrible moaning again. But now, I knew that whatever was making that horrible sound was in the room with me. By the time I turned around, it was already crawling out from underneath the bed. At first, I thought I was looking at a person, bald, head bowed. But when it dragged itself fully out from beneath the mattress, using overly long, bony arms, when I saw it had no legs, the bottom half of its body ending in a jagged tear of open flesh, like the frayed ends of a decaying curtain, I realized it was something else. I fell back, clattering against the wall and falling to the floor as it inched closer. It came to a stop merely a few feet away. Suddenly, from that jagged, open wound, it spat out a troop of small, scuttling things that looked like something between a spider and a disembodied hand. That's what I'd seen in the fireplace. One of these creatures. They climbed the walls, disappearing behind furniture, into vents, and out through the bedroom door I'd kicked open. I ran from the room, screaming, desperate to get out of the house. But every doorknob, every latch, every possible exit was in the grip of one of those things. Balled up like a fist, solid as a rock, unmovable, turning the house into a tomb, silent except for the pained cries of whatever it was I'd found in the bedroom, as it slowly began to stalk me in a game of cat and mouse that could only have one conclusion. I left this written account of my experience hidden in the house. If you're reading it, It means I'm gone, and you're probably in the same position I was. Lured here by Jeffrey. Confused, tearing through the place in search of some explanation for what's going on. Go now, if you still can. The only thing that awaits you here is death.